Friends, we are on a journey that we started a couple weeks ago, but that journey, as we mentioned a couple weeks ago, began far before us, right? That is why we are exploring these stories from Genesis at the beginning, these stories that seek to share meaning about how the people of God, how a family of God formed, were shaped, and how they continued on a journey of formation, reformation, how they experienced challenges and joys. Alongside that journey, we are lifting up the journey of this community of faith, of First United Church. And there are some similarities that I see. There are some similarities that I experience in contemplating and reflecting on these stories. So we have here in the reading, the story continues about Sarah and Abraham, right? We've started their story. We started that couple weeks ago. We continued it last week, and it's moving forward today. They are without a so-called proper heir. They have tried other means to fulfill God's promise for them. And here the divine shows up. In some of your minds, perhaps proper Trinitarian form, shows up to Abraham and promises him, with Sarah overhearing, promises that Sarah, in her old age, will bear a child. Laughable. It's impossible. How could something like that ever happen? She hasn't had a child in her 90-plus years. How is she going to have a child now? And also maybe nervously laughing, because she's like, oh my goodness, what if I had a child in this age? How would my body handle it? How would my mind handle it? How would our household handle it? Kids disrupt all kinds of things. But then we continue the story, and the promise comes to fruition. And Isaac, which means to laugh, laughter, is born, enters the scene. God's promise is kept, even when it seemed impossible. So as I have been reading, as I have been discovering and exploring our church history, I remember I shared with you a couple of Sundays ago that in the roles, they used to designate how somebody had left, and sometimes they would leave because they were dismissed. They were kicked out of the church for unchristian-like behavior. Well, I found a few examples of what that unchristian-like behavior was in a letter that was shared with the Bedford Association of the American Baptist side of our family in August 1871. All right? Here are some examples of what they meant. They shared that it has been their painful duty. Think of that loop that I was showing the children with the two sides. The painful duty to exclude 7 of our members. Of these, one was for non-attendance at our regular meetings, but he has since been restored. Another was a young sister we received by baptism, and we believed to be hopefully converted, but she wished to join the Methodist Church. Yeah, to which her father belonged. Another was of middle age that joined us during the year and conducted himself well, except in one thing. He had contracted the habit of moderately dram drinking, but never getting intoxicated, and being reproved by a committee, said it was necessary for his health, and he couldn't leave it off. The remaining 4 consisted of a family of very degraded, ignorant people that brought letters from a country church in Jackson County. We could not refuse them admittance, but soon found that they were unworthy of a place in the church. And they go on to say, "And now the dead branches cut off, we hope to grow and increase like the grain of mustard seed until we become a great tree." It might seem, reviewing this letter from 1871, laughable that years later, after having been part of forming the Bedford Association on our Baptist side of our family, after having been some of the instigators of that formation, that years later in early 2000s, First Baptist Church, United Church of Christ, our name at the time, would be kicked out of that association, would be said that you have been exhibiting unchristian-like behavior. Why? What was the reason? Some of you were here. Some of you know the reason. I don't have the exact date. I haven't been able to find it, but I'm in contact with our Rochester, Genesee region, who are now our home in the American Baptist Church, to discover what year exactly it happened. Some of you may know, and if you do, you're free to shout it out. But I know it was between 2001 and 2004 that this community, that our ancestors and faith of First United dared to ordain an openly gay man, Gene McAfee. And the Bedford Association didn't like that. And they said, "Hey, promise you won't do it again, and you can stay." And our ancestors, some who are sitting here among us today, said, "No, I think we might do that again." And sought a home elsewhere, looked to be included within the circle somewhere else, and went to Indianapolis, thought, maybe they're a little more progressive than our Bedford siblings. They were a little more progressive, but not quite there, because by one vote, we were not admitted into that association. So I guess the hunt was on then, and Rochester, Genesee in New York said, "Welcome, welcome. We are a Mobius Strip type association where we indeed are all one. Welcome, family." But friends, that's not where the journey started. That's not where Abraham and Sarah, their journey didn't start right there, right? They had more that was before that. This church has gone through shifts and transitions. And it may be that you didn't even have to think about 1870s to find it laughable that we would make that shift as a congregation in the early 2000s. But maybe you were here in the 1970s. Maybe you were here at that time when a young freshman at IU by the name of Cindy Stone first came to this community of faith and joined in the fellowship as best she could as a lesbian woman. Unfortunately, while she experienced the welcome and the generosity of many members of this congregation, there were those in places of leadership, specifically those on the church council at the time, and those in this position, the senior minister. Some of you might remember Bob Curtis, who made it very clear to her, saying that they could not imagine a woman, let alone a lesbian woman, in a position of leadership in the church. But being in a relationship, and I will tell you, Cindy did say I could share her name and share her story openly. She felt she had to leave because she needed to offer care and support to her partner who had a terminal illness at the time in the mid-90s. And so she went to a different community and missed this church, maintained friendships as best she could, still in Bloomington, not that large of a city. But she couldn't call this place her church home because there was an inside and there was an outside. There was a line that had been drawn, and she was told, you can go no further because of who you are. But she started hearing some talk. She maybe heard some talk about Reverend McAfee being ordained here under the leadership of the new senior minister, Tom Sun, pushed and supported by the wonderful Norm Overly. And she dared to come back. In 2005, and I can only imagine that there were conversations then that were coming. In 2005, the United Church of Christ passed a resolution at General Synod that affirmed marriage equality for all. So I can only imagine that people within this congregation were having those conversations. Well, we have moved in this direction. We have lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex folks in our communities, whether as couples or individuals, as families. They are here. How can we express that openness more fully, more directly, more explicitly? And they realized they had two options. Because they have two families of faith. We have two families of faith. On our American Baptist side, we are welcoming and affirming. And on our UCC side, we are open and affirming, hence us being OWA, open, welcoming, and affirming. And I was able to go back and see some notes, some minutes from church council meetings. I don't recommend that you take that up as a habit or a hobby. It is not super fun to look through old council minutes and you're like, what were they talking about? But I was excited for this one. I was searching. I was on the hunt because I knew in 2008, that is when we moved forward. And in 2007, these conversations were happening. Classes were happening. Discussions were happening around what it would mean to cement that as our identity, as a core piece of our identity, of living out the love of Jesus, the love of God in this community and in this time and place. And many thanks to the committee at that time. In particular, many thanks to Mary Peckham, who is with us here today, and to Donovan Walling, the late partner of Sam Troxel, who crafted together our open, welcoming, and affirming statement for us in 2008 that was affirmed in September of 2008. I wanted to share with you definitely those words, but I wanted to share with you the words of the then president, Sarah Burton, as she invited people to continue on this journey. She wrote, I want to focus the second part of my letter to you on the open, welcoming, and affirming OWA statement. In Jesus Christ, all are one. That the council will ask members of our congregation to approve on September 14th. What a shift, friends, right? Over the years, our congregation has demonstrated its leadership in stepping up to embrace controversial issues when others would not. First United has already firmly established itself as a welcoming church family. We have opened our hearts and our doors and welcomed several GLBT singles and couples into full fellowship. For most, It is the first time that their spiritual gifts have found expression. Now, many can openly worship and focus their ministry gifts and energy into programs that are important and meaningful, not only to them, but also to everyone at First United. Just as important are the new members who are not GLBT, but come to our fellowship because of this open, affirming, and loving church. Many American Baptist churches are welcoming and affirming. Open and affirming, that is ONA, is the official position of the UCC denominations. The statement of First United is a well-written document that formalizes who we already are. And it expresses our faithfulness in affirming everyone who wishes to worship with us, everyone who wishes to worship God, can come to First United freely, openly, and without fear. She continues, it is one short step forward to officially embrace the OWA statement. Adoption of this statement would allow First United to officially list itself as an open and welcoming and affirming congregation. This designation is especially supportive of the GBLT community. But read the document thoughtfully. It is inclusive of many others who have felt the sting of rejection by the church, by Christian communities. The OWA statement does not shift or change anything about First United. We are simply forging a wider, broader pathway so that everyone can come and worship with us. Once again, she states, our congregation is called upon to demonstrate its capacity for leadership. And because indeed the words are beautiful and the words are very well written, and they are found on our website, some of you may have found them there. Actually, for us to participate in Bloomington Pride and at the Spencer Pride, I have to share a link to that place where we specifically, explicitly acknowledge our welcome, claim that welcome and that affirmation. And these are the words you will find if you go to our website. These are the words that are shared with these broader communities. First United Church is an open, welcoming, and affirming church. Following the faith traditions of the American Baptist Churches, USA, and the United Church of Christ, we believe that God's Spirit calls us to embrace diversity fully in our congregation and community, and to affirm the dignity and worth of every person without regard to race, sex, gender, age, sexual orientation, faith, nationality, ethnicity, economic or marital status, or physical, mental, or emotional disability. We are guided by the Spirit of Jesus who reached out to each and every one, just as he did when he encountered the Samaritan woman at the well in John 4:4-26. Far from avoiding contact as a so-called upright rabbi, as an up and standing rabbi of the time would have been expected to do, Jesus offered her and everyone else, regardless of condition, the water of eternal life. We believe, as Paul affirmed in Galatians 3:28, there is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer slave or free, there is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. I'm imagining a Mobius strip here. Maybe Paul didn't know of the Mobius strip, because that came later in the 1800s. As an inclusive community of Christian faith, First United Church has a rich history of welcoming into worship and fellowship those who may have been turned away by other churches. For example, our church embraced racial integration at a time when few churches were willing to do so. Now, we acknowledge the history of institutional condemnation and exclusion of gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and intersex persons and are committed to work to end such discrimination. We welcome all into our full membership and participation as children of God. And we affirm and celebrate all loving, committed relationships. We value diversity. We are united in our faith in Jesus Christ. That faith is central to our witness. Our purpose is to help each other to live out this Christian commitment through worship, study, and service, as we are also committed to invite others to share the good news of Jesus Christ. Friends, in 2008, our ancestors, some of those among us, dared to take another step forward in creating, in sharing God's welcome, in building that place that we sang about at the open of worship, where all are loved, where all are indeed welcome, all meaning all, okay? All meaning all, not all meaning some are inside and some are outside. If you exhibit these unchristian-like behaviors, well, then you don't belong here. All meaning all. Mobius strip, all. Oneness in our faith and in our welcome. And friends, we are invited to trust in the wisdom of those ancestors and to learn from Sarah, who laughs here, perhaps in disbelief, and who is shown that God's promises do come true. God's promises do come to fruition. To have that faith, to be a part of bringing those promises to fruition. Yesterday at the annual gathering of the Indiana-Kentucky Conference, those of us who gathered for worship were invited to contemplate the story of the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years, who had such a deep faith that she trusted. She had heard about this guy named Jesus, who could offer healing, who could offer wholeness, who could offer welcome to her. And she dared to just barely touch the garment of his hem. She had that faith that God's healing power could transform her life. Do I take that story literally? No. But I take that story very, very much to be powerful and to be true, that God's promise of welcome, of love, of acceptance for who we are, for who you are. That's true. That's reality, and that is the world we are invited and called to create. That is the path we are continually called to journey upon together. So friends, let us recall our history, our ancient history, our nearer history, and let us receive the invitation, let us receive the encouragement, let us receive the challenge from our ancestors in faith to continue on that journey. How, friends, indeed, are we invited to live out that open, welcoming, and affirming statement? So it's not only a statement, but we are living that faith authentically, as our purpose statement writes, declares. Living that faith, the teachings of Jesus, rooted in compassion, truth, and justice, authentically in community, to create, to co-create a better world. Friends, I invite you to contemplate that invitation, that encouragement, that challenge received by our ancestors, offered to us here in this moment by the divine who is right here with us. Friends, how will we continue to move forward and to live out God's all-encompassing, all-embracing, Mobius strip-like love? Friends, let us be together now for a moment of reflection, a moment of meditation. Let us be together now for a brief moment of pause.